Well, hello, my name is Ashley Best, and welcome to Best Practices. This is the first presentation in a series that I call Best Practices. And today we're going to talk about home composting. And since today is May 4th, and some of you may be a Star Wars fan, so may the 4th be with you. And I do have some little hidden Star Wars themed characters throughout the presentation. So after this slide, starting on the next slide, see how many you can count, how many you can find in the pictures and graphics and things like that. And there will be a free soil sample offered to the first person who can guess it right. And I'm going to send out a follow-up survey. So if you are the closest one and you get that survey in first, then you will win a free soil sample. So, like I said before, my name is Ashley Best, and I am the Newton County Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent, as well as the County Extension Coordinator. So there's my email, and this whole composting presentation came about with a partnership with Sustainable Newton. I am so excited to be connected with them and hopefully, partner with them on future endeavors and work together to, make sure that we are providing the best resources for our community and increasing, that sustainable mindset. So here are our objectives for today. We're going to talk about what is compost and why do we want to do it, the efficiency of composting and how to become more efficient, materials needed. We're also going to look at 3 different composting structures. We're going to look at how to prepare the pile and maintaining the pile. And then we're going to end with suggested uses for composting. And then I do have a video for us to watch at the end for a little different take on composting. And if you have any questions throughout this whole presentation, you're more than welcome to unmute. You can raise your hand, you can type it in the chat box. So I will be monitoring that as we go through. So just a little quote, the earth is what we all have in common. So I feel like it's our duty to make sure that we are being sustainable and that we are, reducing our waste, we are recycling, reusing. So composting is a great way to do that. I don't know if you can hear the sirens going on. So what is compost? Compost is a stable material with a content called humus, and it's a dark brown or black soil-like earthy smell, and it's used to amend the soil, and it's created using very high temperatures that destroy the pathogens, weed seeds, and other natural decompositions or other ways that the natural decomposition does not destroy. So, landscape refuse, just such as grass, grass clippings, trimmings, leaves, things like that, can all be used to make compost. And over time, naturally, it happens on the forest floor. Leaves fall and plants die out and decay, and they absorb and retain moisture, and the microbes begin to break those down, but it happens relatively slow. And we like to rake those leaves, and so then we end up robbing the we end up robbing the soil of those nutrients whenever we rake those leaves, from our grass and our yards. So, one of the reasons why we need to compost is to prevent the stormwater from, bringing in all of those nutrients and excess nutrients. So every time it rains, the water picks up debris, pet waste, sediment, chemicals, and it flows from the streets and goes directly into our streams, rivers, and lakes. And too much nutrients can cause an algal bloom, fish kills, loss of other aquatic life, and we want to make sure that we are, allowing those nutrients to break down completely and decompose so that it's not ending up in our water systems. And grass clippings, I don't know about you, but one of my biggest pet peeves is seeing people blow grass clippings on the road. Grass clippings are great on your lawn. They provide a good thatch layer, which is essential for healthy grass in yards. But it's very bad in the streets, and eventually it goes down the storm drains, and it's carrying those excess nutrients and potential pesticides into our waterways. So as you're mowing your yard, either bag your clippings to use on the compost pile, or leave them in the lawn itself, and try not to blow it on the streets or the sidewalks or anything like that. So 28% of organic wastes are in our waste stream. So it's vegetable and fruit scraps, yard trimmings, and things like that. They make up 28% of our waste stream. And we can reduce that number by composting. And in 2018, the EPA estimated that there was about 2.6 million tons of food composted. So we can definitely increase that number just by having your own small backyard compost. So some quick benefits of composting, it reduces the need for chemical fertilizers. It does not replace them. In some cases it can, but it definitely reduces that need. It also enhances water retention in the soil. And when you are, focusing on growing plants and growing gardens and things like that, that moisture is essential for plant growth. And it's also going to suppress some plant diseases and pests by keeping your plants healthier in the long run. Also, it provides some carbon sequestering opportunities. It reduces the methane emissions from landfills, and it definitely lowers your carbon footprint. Beneficial bacteria and fungi, this encourages the production of those beneficial bacteria that break down the organic matter and create that rich nutrient-filled material. So although in time uncomposted materials will eventually decompose, large quantities of uncomposted leaves incorporated in the soil will leave a nitrogen deficiency because they use up all of the nitrogen in the soil. So you want to make sure that you compost before and then add it into your soil. There are 4 requirements to composting, and it's pretty simple. This is actually one of the easiest endeavors that you can do. A lot of times for efficient composting, it requires aeration, moisture, particle size consideration, and temperature. So for aeration, the oxygen is required for microbes to decompose that organic waste efficiently. And some decomposition occurs in the absence of oxygen, which is an anaerobic condition, but that process is very slow. And a lot of times foul odors may develop. So to control that odor problem, composting without oxygen is not recommended in a residential setting. So you want to make sure that you are having lots and lots of oxygen. And you want to mix that pile up once or twice a month. Sorry, the privet's blooming and it's gotten my throat all crazy. Next is moisture, and you want to make sure that you have adequate moisture for that microbial activity. Dry compost will not decompose efficiently. And if rainfall is limited, you definitely want to make sure that you're watering your compost pile. And we'll talk more about watering and when to water and how much in the preparing and maintaining the pile. Next is particle size. So for the particle size, grinding the material into smaller particle sizes before composting greatly reduces that decomposition time. And the smaller the particle size, the more quickly those microbes can consume it. And a shredder is useful for chipping or shredding most of the yard waste. And it is essential if you want to use brush or wood. Something is tickling my throat.
It's in the air.
I know it is in the air, and like I said, it's I think for me it's the privet. Like that early wave of pollen that we got did not affect me at all. Whatever's blooming right now is affecting me.
I'm glad to see your tip about grinding, because my landscaper always throws the brush in the compost pile. I'm like, that's never going to decompose.
I know it will take forever to decompose if you if you don't chip it up or make it into a smaller size. So a low-cost method of reducing leaf size is to mow the yard before you rake up your leaves. And to mow the yard before you rake up the leaves, and if you have a bagger, you can bag those leaves, and it makes it even easier to collect those leaves and put directly into your compost. The last thing we're going to talk about is temperature. So low outside temperatures slow the activity down. And warmer temperatures actually speed up decomposition. The microbes that make up the bulk of the decomposition process fall into two categories. Ones that live in temperatures 50 degrees to 113 degrees, and ones that live between 113 degrees Fahrenheit and 158 degrees Fahrenheit. So a well-mixed, adequately working compost pile will heat up to temperatures around 110 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And those microbes will actively feed on the organic materials at those temperatures. And also, the good thing about the high temperatures is it will help destroy the weed seeds as well as any diseases that are within that that compost pile. So when we're talking about the efficiency rate of composting, it's essential for you to know what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is. And to have the greatest microbial activity, you want to have a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And like Maurice was saying, if you have a higher carbon ratio with that added wood or sawdust or leaves, it's going to take longer to decompose. And if the compost isn't properly decomposed, it will have a high carbon content and will use the nitrogen from the soil to continue decomposing. So if you take a compost that isn't mature and you apply it to your garden, it's going to rob those nitrogen elements from the soil to continue decomposing, and therefore it's not going to be available for your plants. So here we have some different examples of what the carbon to nitrogen ratio would be. So for grass clippings, it's going to be about a 19 to 1. Your typical fruit waste, like peels and things like that, are going to be a 35 to 1. And then things like sawdust and wood are going to be on up there in the 500 to 700 to 1 range. And they're going to take a lot longer to break down rather than that alfalfa hay that's at the 12 to 1. So when you're looking at that, let me go back. When you're looking at that carbon to nitrogen ratio, sawdust can be added in moderate amounts, and so can wood, but you're probably going to have to add additional nitrogen to your pile. And applying 1 pound of actual nitrogen is required for the breakdown of 100 pounds of dry sawdust. And other organic material to add nutrients to the pile are blood meal and bone meal, livestock manures, it's in that 20 to 1 range, and fresh green plants. The green plants typically are considered like the nitrogen fuel, and then the brown stuff is more like the carbon. So here we have some examples of browns and greens. Browns would be dead leaves, branches, twigs, coffee grounds, things like, or your eggshells, things like that. And then your greens would be the coffee grounds, the grass clippings, the vegetable waste, fruit scraps, and all of those green things. So here are things to compost: eggshells, tea bags are great, shredded newspaper, cardboard, cotton and wool rags. It takes a little bit longer, but they do compost. You can compost fireplace ashes, but in small quantities. So you don't want to do that every time. And things not to compost. You don't want to compost any dairy, fats, meat, and fish. It's definitely going to cause odors and create problems. So Melissa asked, don't many tea bags contain plastic? So typically on the container, it will say if it's recyclable. So you always just want to make sure and double check that those tea bags are recyclable. And a lot of the plastics that they're using are plant-based plastics and will, compost easily. And it's really good just to be mindful to look at the labeling on all of your products. Typically you'll see that little recyclable or compostable symbol, and they will. You can ensure that it's gonna be good for your compost. But back to the dairy and the fats and the meat and the fish, it's gonna attract pests like rodents and flies, and it's gonna cause a terrible stench. And you just want to stay away from trying to compost any of those things. You also want to try to not compost the diseased or the insect-ridden plants. I know if you have like a plum tree and it has a disease called black knot, then you're going to want to not compost those limbs. You might as well just burn them or remove them completely from the property. And burning is a great way to do that, to ensure that that disease is not going to be transferred back to other plants in the future. You definitely don't want to, compost any pet waste. There definitely could be a potential to have bacteria, germs, pathogens, and other zoonotic diseases that could be passed on to humans. And yard trimmings treated with chemicals or pesticides. Sometimes if it goes through a heat cycle, that half-life of the pesticide or chemical will, be released and decomposed throughout the compost, but sometimes it stays around. And I know a lot of times, like horse manure, if it doesn't go through a proper heat cycle and that composting, and those horses have been grazing on a product called Grazon, which is a 2,4-D based field spray, then that Grazon could have residual effect through the manure on your garden or your yard. And that would be, I've heard a lot of stories of that, where they're like, oh, I went and bought some, horse manure from a local stable, and those horses have been grazing on a Grazon treated hay or pasture. Doesn't hurt the horses. It's a great control of weeds, but it just has that residual effect, and it wasn't properly composted. So here is the absolute simplest way to compost. So if you want to, it's called like the lazy man compost. It's easy to handle, requires minimal maintenance. You just get a big old black or blue or black garbage bag, and make sure it's that thick one, that 30 to 40 gallon thick one. And to each bag, you add your plant waste about halfway up, and then you add 1 tablespoon of garden fertilizer with a high nitrogen content. And then you add about 1 cup of hydrated lime. It helps counteract the extra acidity caused by the anaerobic composting. So this is more of an anaerobic type thing. And after you fill the bag with your plant waste, your fertilizer, and your lime, you want to add about 1 quart of water. That's going to ensure that the moisture is at the proper level. You want to close that bag up tightly and set it aside for 6 months to a year. And you can set the bags in a basement or heated garage for better decomposition during the winter months. And you will not have to turn the mixture or add water after closing the bag. So this is, like I said, this is a complete lazy man, hands-off way to compost. And because the oxygen is limited, though, the process is very slow. This is kind of like a set and forget kind of thing. And next thing you know, in a year, you have your compost. If you're looking for a little bit more hands-on, faster way to decompose your yard waste and your food waste, these next 3 composting structures are where you want to go. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to each one of these, and you just have to figure out which one is going to fit your situation and which one is going to be best for your yard or your operation. The first one we're going to talk about is the barrel or the drum. Next, we will talk about the circular bin. And then finally, we will discuss the 3-bin system. With the barrel or drum, you want to get about a 55-gallon barrel with a secured lid, and you want to drill 9 rows of holes, 1.5 or 1/2 inch holes, and over the length of the barrel to allow air circulation and drainage of excess moisture. And then you can see my marker here. You want to put that barrel upright on blocks, and that's going to allow air circulation through the bottom. You want to fill it about 2/3 full with your organic waste. And that could be that, you want to make sure you keep that carbon to nitrogen ratio about 30-1 and ensure that you have enough dry material and enough nitrogen material to ensure proper breakdown. You can also add in that, 1/4 cup of nitrogen fertilizer. That's just going to give it a head start with that nitrogen content. And then apply your water if needed until it's moist. You do not want it sopping wet. So every few days, flip that barrel on its side, roll it around the yard, mix it up, and then put it back on the blocks. And that's going to ensure that you're getting it all the way around, and all of those organic waste materials will eventually at one point be on the inside where it's heating up, it's getting the most decomposition, and your compost should be ready in 2 to 4 months. And it's a great choice for the city dweller, or if you have a relatively small yard. And removing the lid can definitely ensure more air to penetrate, and also it can allow for rain to penetrate if it's going to rain and you haven't watered it in a while. Now, if you have a large family or you have larger quantities of waste, you can use the circular bin. So the circular bin can be made using a length of small spaced woven wire fencing held together with chain snaps. So this bin should be about 5 feet in diameter and at least 4 to 5 feet high. In order to maintain the shape, you can actually add a stake in the middle of the bin before adding the material, and that just kind of helps balance that material out and add some structure to it. And with this design, it's actually easy to turn the compost material by simply unsnapping it here, removing the wire from around the edges, moving it over a few feet, snapping it back together, and then shoveling your compost from the top down into the new bin. So, and turning it back into the compost pile and putting it back in. That's a great way to, and you really only have to do that maybe like once a week, if that, once every other week. Turning it once every other week is going to ensure that there's a lot of aeration and it's going to compost a lot faster. Now, my favorite way to compost is the 3-chambered bin. And it holds a considerable amount of compost, and it also allows for good air circulation. This is a very efficient, durable structure. And it works on the assembly line idea by having 3 batches of compost in varying stages. And what you want to do is start out with, in your first bin, you want to start out with a balanced mixture of compost material and allowed to heat up for 3 to 5 days. So then you take what's in this first bin and you shovel it over into the next bin. And you start a new pile in that first bin. You start adding your new leaves and food waste and things like that into your first bin. And you go another 4 to 7 days or so, and you then flip it into the next bin. And by the time it gets to this last bin, it will have reduced its size to about half, and you will have a finished or nearly finished compost material. And so you can see in the picture down here, in this first bin, they have, that's all of your organic waste there. And then in the middle bin, they have the partially decomposed materials. And then in the last bin, that's the finished compost. So this is a very, very well built 3-bin chamber. When you're building it, you want to make sure that you're when you're building it, you want to make sure that your bin is made out of rot-resistant wood. So using like a redwood or cedar is going to be the best. And it will definitely last several years, and you want to have slats in the front. So you can see right here, there are slats in the front that will allow you to easily shovel out that compost and put it into the next bin. So this is a great system if you think that you're going to have a lot of compost, or you want to create a lot of compost, or it's good for communities, neighborhoods, things like that, to have in this process. So where should you put your compost bin? You definitely want to put your compost bin where it will be used often and where you think about it, because it's easy to kind of forget, especially if you have one that requires turning. So set a reminder on your phone, and make sure that you are utilizing it. And you also want to put it in a place where it's protected from drying winds and where it gets partial sunlight. You don't want it to be exposed to full sun, because then you're going to be required to water it a lot more. And the more wind and the more sun the pile is exposed to, the more water you're going to have to use. So when you're preparing the pile, so we are ready to get started. We've built our composting structure. We know exactly where it's going to be. We're ready to start adding materials. So the first thing you want to do is put in your coarse materials. That's your browns. So things like your leaves, your chipped up wood, things like that. And that's going to create your base and create sort of a chimney effect that's going to allow the air to come in and aerate that area. And you want to moisten that layer in each layer as you're putting it in. The next layer is going to be your organic waste. Your leaves, your grass, plant trimmings are all put into a layer that's 8 to 10 inches deep. And this layer should definitely be watered as well, but making sure that it's not soggy. That's the key. We do not want a soggy compost pile. We want it to be sufficiently wet, but not soggy. And then next, you want to add a layer of soil or completed compost. So that ensures that the pile is inoculated with those decomposing microbes. That just kind of gives you a head start and ensures that it's going to have those microbes there. And studies have shown that there's no advantage to purchasing a compost starter or an inoculum. You just add some soil, and they're already there. Those microbes are free. They're already there, and once you add it in, they'll get started on reproducing and decomposing that area. And then finally, at the top of your pile, you want to add 2 to 3 inches of livestock manure, or that nitrogen fertilizer equivalent at a rate of 1/3 cup to every 25 square feet of surface area. And do not use fertilizers that contain a herbicide or pesticide. So don't put a weed and feed on there or anything like that. So, and you just want to, layer and layer and layer eventually until you have a really good mixture, and let it set for several days to a week to 2 weeks, and just turn it whenever you think about it. Composting is actually very, very easy, especially if you are patient and you aren't in a hurry to get compost. If you're just wanting a place to put your your food waste, this is a great option. So you want to repeat that process, adding the coarse material, the water, the fertilizer, the organic waste, And the pile should be about 5 feet high, and you want to top that off with 5 to 8 inches of straw or hay, and that's going to ensure that the moisture is retained and you have the adequate amount of water in your compost pile. So once you've made it, we've gotten everything in our pile, and to maintain it, you want to turn the pile once a month. And in that barrel, it says, 3 to 5 days if you want it faster. And so it all depends on how quickly you want this compost to be created. So, but typically turning it once a month, you can prevent the odors, hasten the decomposition, and it exposes those seeds, insect larvae, and pathogens to those lethal temperatures that are inside the middle of that pile. Next, you want to keep it moist, making sure that you're adding the correct amount of water, and the shrinking and settling. The leaves will shrink approximately 30% of their original volume. And a well-managed compost pile under warm conditions should be ready in about 2 to 4 months. Some problems that you may encounter, let's say your compost has a bad odor. That means that there's not enough air, and you want to turn that pile and add dry material if it's too wet. So let's say the center is too dry. Let's say you turn it and the center is completely dry. So there's not enough water to actively, break down and ensure those microbes are at the activity level they need to be. So turn the pile and then water it in. Let's say you have a damp and warm, but it's only in the middle, only in the very center. That means your pile is too small. You want to collect more materials and add the mixture to the old ingredients and create a new pile. Or let's say you've got everything piled up and it looks great, but it's just not heating up. You've turned it, it's not really hot. That's from a lack of nitrogen. So you want to mix in a nitrogen source like fresh grass clippings, manure, blood meal, or even that cup of fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizer that you buy in the stores. Uses for compost. There are many, many uses, and the first one we're going to talk about is a soil amendment. So it improves physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil. You want to take about 1 to 2 inches of your compost, put it on your soil, and then incorporate that in the top 6 inches of your soil. So that way you are, increasing those properties of the soil. The nutrient content is too low for straight compost to supply all of the nutrients necessary for plant growth. So it's not necessarily a replacement for fertilizer, especially if you're growing some heavy feeders in your vegetable gardens. But it is great to add organic matter and water retention properties to your soil. You can use it as a potting soil mix. However, you want to mix it at 1/4 to 1/3 of the total potting soil mix. Too much compost can result in waterlogging and poor aeration for the roots. So that's not what we want for our potted plants, because the roots are already confined, and we want to make sure that they're getting the proper amount of aeration. And to completely pasteurize the compost for use in your potting mixtures, you can heat up that material in an oven at 160 degrees for about 30 minutes. And that's definitely going to ensure that those weed seeds and diseases are completely killed before you incorporate it into your pots with your potted plants. Mulching, 3 to 6 layers. Thank you, Ms. Janine. Perfect.
That would be great for my throat.
Miss Janina's spoiling me. She brought me some coffee for my throat. When you mulch, you want to do a 3 to 6 inch layer. That's going to suppress weeds, reduce soil erosion, modify soil temperature, so protect plants if it's cold, and conserve that soil moisture. The soil environment beneath the mulch is very favorable for promoting earthworms, which is in turn valuable for aerating the soil. So we all love earthworms. We know they're great for your soils. And so mulching with the compost will just encourage and add to that environment that's suitable for those earthworms. Speaking of earthworms, so this is the video I want us to watch. It's only 5 minutes, but this is kind of a different take on composting. It's called vermicomposting, and we're going to watch this video. So hopefully you guys can hear it. Let me know if you can't hear it.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Sherman. I'm an extension specialist at NC State University, and this is Homegrown in the Garden. Today I'll be showing you how to set up a worm bin so that you can vermicompost your food scraps. It will enrich your soil and make your plants much bigger. As you can see in this picture of turnip, the small turnip had 0 vermicompost, the middle one had 10% by volume, and the large one had 20% by volume vermicompost. First of all, you need to buy or build a worm bin. So you just pick up a container with a lid at a big box store or a hardware store. You know, the worms are living creatures. They need air, so you need to put some holes in the bin for them to breathe. You want to make sure you drill the holes in the upper sides of the bins. And so one option is just to take a hole saw and drill just one hole in each of the shorter ends of the bin. So one each, and then you can go to the gutter section of a hardware store and pick up a soffit vent, and you just pop it in there. And then you want to put about 6 holes in the bottom of the bin, just so that in case you have any excess drainage, that it will come out. And you would want it to go on a piece of plastic. There are over 9,000 species of earthworms, and only 7 have been identified that are suitable for vermicomposting. So you can't use just any worm. If you buy a pound of worms, that's about $1,000. You buy it from a worm grower, it'll cost you around $30. Worms need moisture. You need to put some type of bedding in there. You can just take newspaper, hold it up as if you were going to read it, and then just take a corner and pull it straight down, and you'll get a nice thin strip of newspapers that you can then put into your bucket where you have water, because you want to moisten it. Remember, the worms need 80% moisture for their bodies. You want it to soak for 10 minutes. And then when 10 minutes is up, you can take it and squeeze excess moisture out of it, pull it apart, and put it into the worm bin. And in the worm bin, you're going to fill it up about halfway with that shredded paper. So by the way, never pour water into your worm bin. Instead, if it starts to dry out a little bit, use a plant mister like this and just spritz it into the worm bin. So we've made the bedding, and now we'll just add our worms. And worms will usually come to you from a worm grower either in a bag or a box. I just happened to put my worms in a container today. But anyway, you just gently will empty them onto the top of the bedding and just stand back. They will move under the bedding, so you don't do anything. Take food scraps then, which you've collected. You can collect your food scraps in a container like this where you buy it. It has a lid. Take your lid off your worm bin, and then you'll take your food waste and always have a 3-pronged tool. Gently pull back the bedding, and then you dump some food waste into your bin. You want to make sure to cover it with the bedding. That's very important, because if you don't, you could attract fruit flies. And then you put your lid back on and everything's fine. You can put most types of food waste in here. I have a list in my publication that tells you what not to put in there. For example, if you put citrus into the bin, then that makes it too acidic and it can cause problems. You never want to put dog or cat poop into your worm bin. And you also don't want to put dairy products or meat products into your worm bin, because as they decompose, they're smelly and they can attract unwanted visitors. The worms will excrete what's called castings, and the castings will start to build up in the bottom of the bin. And as they get higher, after about 4 to 6 months, then you'll say, okay, I think it's time to harvest these castings. So you have some options, and the first is called light separation. Earthworms are very sensitive to light, so you can just dump this out on a tarp and you can separate the worms from the castings. So after 4 to 6 months, you'll be able to harvest this wonderful vermicompost from the bottom of your worm bin. Put it in a container labeled black gold because it has an incredible effect on your soil and plants in your garden. This is Rhonda Sherman with Homegrown in the Garden. Be sure to check out my website.
So that's a different take on composting, is the vermiculture and vermicomposting. Some commonly asked questions, frequently asked questions: does compost have any value as fertilizer? And yes, it does. They have some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium contents, but they're in small amounts. And the addition of garden fertilizers speeds up the decomposition and supplies some nutrients as well. But if you're using it in your garden, you're still most likely going to need to apply a fertilizer based on your soil sample recommendations. And taking a soil sample is the surefire way to know exactly what you have and how much, of fertilizers and nutrients we need to add back into that soil for whatever you're growing. And that kind of goes into the second question. It can be used as a source of some nutrients. However, there's not enough nutrients present to supply the needs of most vegetable crops. And is it necessary to add lime, which is calcium, to the compost pile? It is not necessary, and too much lime may cause a loss of nitrogen from the pile, and most finished compost will have a near neutral pH. Is it necessary to add an inoculum to the compost? It may hasten the process. However, there are enough microbes present in the material being composted and in that soil that you're adding into that pile to initiate the process. And is it necessary to shred materials? It is necessary. The finer the material is that goes into the compost pile, the quicker and more thorough the decomposition is going to be. And the most common question is, when is compost ready to use? So the pile returns to normal temperature and the organic material crumbles easily. That's when it's ready to use. At this point, you should not be able to recognize the material that you put into the pile, so you shouldn't see banana peels, eggshells, anything like that. And on average, the composting process takes about 6 to 8 months. And an ideally mixed and tended to pile may take less than 8 weeks. So it depends on how much effort and tending you'd like to put into your compost pile. And that determines when it's going to be ready to use. So your challenge, what you can do to remember to compost at home. So like the container that Rhonda had in her video, you can put that container inside where you see it, next to your trash can, so that instead of putting that food waste into your trash bin, you put it into that scraps container with a closed lid, and empty that container out every so often into your compost pile. And how can you influence others to do the same? I think sharing is caring. So sharing your compost is a great way to get others interested in composting. And and if you're struggling with getting material, share with your neighbors, and they'll hopefully return the favor by adding to your compost pile. So by implementing these small changes one at a time throughout your household and your community, you might not notice the progress, and the next thing you know, it's 3-4 months later, and you have a great usable product that you can say that you contributed to reducing your carbon footprint. and that definitely makes everyone feel better. So most of my material today came from the UGA publication called Composting and Mulching. So if you would like access to that, I can email that out to everyone along with the survey. And here's my contact information. Be sure to check out my blog site. I do post there. I try to do a blog at least once a month, if not every other week, at my blog site. And I will open up the floor to any questions. Oh, one last thing, sorry. So for my best practices series, these are the dates that are coming up. May 25th is our next one. It's going to be about backyard blocks. I will discuss water-wise landscapes. We'll talk about fall gardening tips in July. In August, I'm going to go over basic beekeeping. So that's for people who are interested in having bees, or maybe you just got bees, or you want to get bees and you want to know more. In September, I'm going to partner with the Rockdale County Fax agent, and we're going to talk about vegetable drying and preserving. Then in October, we're going to have an advanced beekeeping series and presentation. We're going to, it's for people who have bees already and you're ready to do more with them. On November 9th, I'm going to have a dairy goat soap making class. We're going to talk about the benefits of dairy goats. And then in December, we're going to have a pruning class. So talking about when to prune, what to prune, and how to prune. So be sure that you follow us on Facebook or Instagram for all of these updates and when we're going to have future best practices series. So I will open it up. Are there any questions? All right, perfect. Well, I thank you guys so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with me. It is now 1 o'clock, so I will go ahead and sign off. So I hope you'll have a wonderful afternoon. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to give me a call or email me. And hopefully you will get started on your compost soon.